America in the 1920s was a boom created by advances in technology and production that would lead to the flourishing of arts and music and to the mobility of classes, as well as new opportunities provided for the middle and lower class.
Okay, for the social part of the 1920s was the rise of a variety of social issues. Conflicts arose concerning what was considered acceptable and respectable, which overall escalated to handling what would be prescribed or made illegal. At this point in the 1920s, the population in cities surpassed records as it rapidly grew. Crime and political corruption became common, and post-World War I, a liberalism point of view began to spread. Around 1925, urban areas began to adopt increasingly liberal views of sex, alcohol, and drugs. But women and minorities benefited from these movements the most. The idea of them being entitled to equality became increasingly prevalent in urban areas, especially amongst the educated, which brought along the 19th Amendment. The 18th Amendment of the United States Constitution established prohibition in the United States, and following the Volstead Act separately set down methods of enforcing the 18th Amendment. With its ratification certified on January 16, 1919, the demand for liquor continued, and the law resulted in the criminalization of producers, suppliers, and supporters and consumers. Speakeasies, also called blind pigs or blind tigers, were established, and they were the establishments of the legally selling of alcohol beverages, and the police, courts, and prisons were overwhelmed with new cases. Organized crime increased in power, and corruption extended among law enforcement officials. The amendment was later repealed in 1933 by ratification of the 21st Amendment, which was the only instance in U.S. history of the repeal of a Constitution amendment. Over here, this is an example of a speakeasy. They were illegal, and this was where most of the busts occurred, where people would be caught drinking the alcohol. And this is just a picture of how women supported prohibition, because usually it was about their husbands drinking, and they were mostly affected, abused, or mistreated. The Harlem Renaissance was a cultural movement that spanned from the 1920s to the 1930s. At this time, it was known as the New Negro Movement, named after the 1925 anthology by Alain Locke, who was considered the chief interpreter for the Harlem movement. Though it was centered in the Harlem neighborhood of New York City, many French-speaking black writers from African and Caribbean colonies who lived in Paris were also influenced by the Harlem Renaissance. It was also referred to as the flowering of Negro literature. During the early 20th century, Harlem became home to a growing Negro middle class, but the greatest influx in African American community came from the Great Migration of blacks to northern cities and the World War I demand for unskilled industrial labor. And the Harlem Renaissance also brought along the Jazz Age, which focused on the evolution of black music and dancing, art, and pretty much entertainment overall. There was a new way of playing the piano, which was called the Harlem Stride style, and was created during the Harlem Renaissance. It helped blur the lines between the poor Negroes and socially elite Negroes. And a traditional jazz band was composed primarily of brass instruments and was considered a symbol of the South. But the piano was still considered an instrument of the wealthy. This is just an example of how things used to be when they were dancing. It was very different compared to the normal white type of parties or clubs.
The 1920s earned the name the Roaring Twenties to the decade's real and sustained prosperity, dizzying technological advancements, and lively culture. The decade marked the flourishing of the modern mass production, mass consumption economy, which gave the fantastic profits to investors and raising living standard of the urban, mid, and working class, which was for the first time, and there was a large minority of Americans who made their livelihood in agriculture. The decade roared with prolonged Depression. The 1920s saw new discoveries and inventions in nearly every field of enterprises that became the foundation of thriving businesses. New business and production methods allowed manufacturers to make large profits. Department stores and service station chains used massive buying power and operating efficiencies to lower prices while increasing service and choice, helping wages to go further. Here's an example of the many things that people would buy during their time. And increased incomes funded a huge increase in consumer spending. Only some of the increased affluence found its way into insurance as a provision for retirement. Shoppers were able to buy big-ticket consumer items like cars, fridges, washing machines, and etc. Previously, these expensive items were only affordable by the wealthy. About half of all installment debt was for cars. It was estimated that 75% of all cars, 85 or 90% of all furniture, 80% of all phonographs, and so on were sold by partial payment. About $140 million worth of clothing was also sold per annum on this plan. The growth in number of millionaires is shown in tax reports by the Treasury Department, who reported that there were 21 individuals with an annual income of over $1 million in 1921 and an estimated 15,000 U.S. millionaires in 1927 and at least one billionaire. Here's an example of a graph showing the increase in income during the 1920s and how the Great Depression affected it. Using borrowed money, speculators pushed up the prices of houses, lands and shares. Shares could be purchased for a down payment of 10%, the remainder of the price being financed by a loan from the sharebroker. It was no coincidence that during this time, executive salaries ballooned to extravagant levels, widening the gap between management and the workers. Wall Street and the banks grew fat on the fees involved in private equity buyouts and corporate mergers and paid large Christmas bonuses to their staff. Business ethics collapsed and corruption was widespread at high levels in politics and business, leading to some high-profile trials. At the beginning of the 20th century, there were no federal income taxes in the United States. In 1908, President Roosevelt endorsed both income and inheritance taxes. China, with its 400 million population, was viewed as the opportunity of all opportunities by American businesses seeking to maintain growth in their industries. Chinese imports were at the $1 billion level in 1927 and growing at about 30% per year. American tariff law set up to protect American businesses contained a uniform schedule of rates for all countries and prescribed penalties when a country attempted dumping or unfair discrimination against American trade.
Many foreign policies were made in this era. So the Five-Power Treaty was a plan to reduce the overall naval might of the world and included many of the major powers. The Dawes Plan was a plan to stabilize Europe's economies, specifically Germany, and just stabilize their currencies. And this is illustrated in this right here. And Harding was the first president of this era and was pretty pointless. He didn't do a whole lot. And he was also in the Ku Klux Klan, which is mildly amusing. And then he died in office, and Coolidge came after him because he was the vice president, and he was pretty capable, and he had a flair for publicity, as shown in the Indian. He dressed up as Indians and cowboys and stuff. And then Hoover was the Secretary of State for the first few presidents, and then became the president himself, so he dominated a lot of the policies for the entire era. The Republican Party dominated this period and embraced government business partnerships. Democrats and other socialists and stuff were largely insignificant. Prohibition was a big issue and bolstered organized crime a lot. And they cut off immigration a lot, and then cut off it even more with the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act. And the women's rights went with the Shepard-Towner Act, helping with prenatal child care, and the KKK did a lot.
The boom led to a variety of issues and conflicts due to the corruption in deciding what was acceptable and respectable. Due to mass speculation, due to the rise in population in cities, the stock market